The sound of the kettle whistling broke the silence of Margaret's kitchen. She moved instinctively, pouring steaming water over a solitary tea bag, her thoughts far away. At 52, her days had settled into a comfortable monotony. Wake up, tend to the garden, read a book, watch the news. The sameness was both her refuge and her prison. It wasn't that Margaret disliked her life, it was simply quiet. Widowed for nearly a decade, she had grown accustomed to her solitude, though at times it weighed heavy on her. Her children were grown, their visits sporadic. She filled the void with small, predictable joys. A perfectly baked loaf of bread, a newly blossomed flower in her garden. That morning, however, she felt restless. Her pantry was running low, and the thought of venturing into town felt like a small adventure. She grabbed her coat and headed to the grocery store. The aisles were a familiar maze, yet today felt different. Margaret lingered over apples, turning each one over in her hand as though their ripeness held some secret significance. "Looks like you're serious about finding the perfect one," came a voice from beside her. Startled, she glanced up. A young man stood there, smiling. A boy, really, in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark, kind eyes and an energy that felt out of place in the humdrum grocery store. He held a bag of oranges, one brow cocked in amusement. Margaret chuckled softly. "I suppose I am. Old habits. It's all about the sound," he said, tapping one of the oranges gently. "That's how you know it's fresh." She smiled, her curiosity piqued by his unexpected friendliness. "Is that so?" They spoke for a few minutes, about fruit, of all things. But there was an ease to their conversation that Margaret hadn't felt in years. His name was Eric, she learned, and he worked as a photographer in town. When he excused himself with a warm goodbye and an orange tossed lightly into his cart, Margaret stood frozen for a moment, the interaction replaying in her mind. As she finished her shopping, a faint smile lingered on her lips. Later that evening, back in her quiet kitchen, Margaret realized she couldn't stop thinking about their chance meeting. It wasn't anything he'd said or done, not exactly. It was the way he'd looked at her, spoken to her, not with pity or indifference, but with genuine interest. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the faintest flicker of something she thought she'd long since lost. Excitement. The next time Margaret went to the grocery store, she caught herself scanning the aisles for him. It was a ridiculous notion. She told herself, what were the odds? Yet when she saw Eric near the bakery section, her heart skipped in a way that surprised her. "Back for more produce advice?" he teased as she approached, holding up a baguette. "Not unless you know how to pick the perfect loaf of bread," she replied, smiling despite the self-conscious flutter in her chest. Their conversation flowed easily again, this time stretching beyond fruit and bread. Eric told her about his photography, how he loved capturing everyday moments that most people overlooked. Margaret listened intently, drawn to the passion in his voice. "And you?" he asked, tilting his head. "What keeps you busy?" Margaret hesitated. "Oh, nothing as exciting. Gardening mostly. Reading. Quiet things." "Quiet doesn't mean boring," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes, that's where the beauty is." It was a simple comment, but it stayed with her long after they parted ways. Over the next few weeks, they seemed to bump into each other more frequently. Margaret began to look forward to these encounters, which soon extended beyond the grocery store. One day, Eric invited her to join him for coffee at a small cafe nearby. They sat at a corner table, sipping their drinks as rain pattered against the windows. Eric shared stories of his travels, his voice animated as he described the vibrant markets of Marrakesh and the serene landscapes of Iceland. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, her cheeks warm from his attention. "You have a wonderful laugh," he said suddenly, catching her off guard. Margaret's smile faltered for a moment. "I suppose I don't use it often enough." "Maybe that's something we can change," Eric replied, his tone light but sincere. The days that followed were brighter, fuller. They began meeting intentionally, walking through the park, visiting local markets, even spending an afternoon photographing her garden. Eric brought a fresh energy into Margaret's life, and she found herself sharing things she hadn't told anyone in years. Their connection felt natural, unforced. Yet in quiet moments, Margaret couldn't help but question why someone like Eric, a man so vibrant and full of potential, would choose to spend his time with her. The thought both thrilled and unsettled her. Still, As they said goodbye one crisp autumn evening, his hand lingering on hers for just a moment too long, Margaret realized she didn't want to let go. It was an ordinary moment that changed everything. They were walking through the park on a late afternoon, the golden light filtering through the trees. Eric was telling a story about his childhood, his laughter light and uninhibited. Margaret, drawn in by his voice, caught herself watching the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And then it hit her, the warmth spreading through her chest, the ease she felt in his presence. It wasn't just friendship. The realization struck like a sudden gust of wind, leaving her unsteady. She cared for him in a way that went beyond companionship. Her heart raced, a mix of wonder and fear swirling within her. This was not part of her carefully ordered life. She was a woman who prided herself on control and practicality, yet here she was, blindsided by emotions she hadn't felt in decades. That evening, as she prepared dinner in her quiet kitchen, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about him. The way his hand had brushed hers while they walked, the way he had looked at her as though she were someone extraordinary. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, slicing vegetables with a force that betrayed her inner turmoil. He was younger, significantly so. What could he possibly see in her beyond casual companionship? She paused, knife in hand, and leaned against the counter. And why does it matter what he sees? The question lingered, its simplicity cutting through her spiraling thoughts. The truth was, she felt alive when she was with him, more alive than she had in years. It wasn't just about him being younger, it was about how he made her feel. Still, doubts crept in, persistent and unyielding. She worried about what others might think, about how this could end in heartbreak. But beneath the fear was a quiet hope she couldn't ignore. The next time they met, Margaret couldn't help but notice how her perception of him had shifted. Every laugh, every touch, every glance seemed imbued with a deeper meaning. It was both thrilling and terrifying. Eric, as perceptive as ever, seemed to sense a change in her. "You're quieter today," he remarked as they sat on a bench overlooking the river. Margaret forced a smile. "Just enjoying the moment." He nodded, his gaze steady and warm. "Moments like these are worth savoring." Later, as she lay awake in bed, her mind replayed his words. Moments like these. For the first time in years, Margaret found herself longing, not for the past or some distant future, but for the present. And for the possibility that it could hold something she never dared to dream of again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for Margaret. She vacillated between an intoxicating excitement she hadn't felt in years, and an oppressive wave of doubt that clung to her like a heavy mist. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself one evening, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. Her reflection stared back, revealing every wrinkle and gray strand she had earned over decades of life. Her mind spiraled. Society had always been unkind to relationships like this, especially when the woman was older. Would people see her as desperate? Would Eric wake up one day and realize she wasn't enough? But then she would remember the way he looked at her, as though she were the most fascinating person in the room. She would recall his kindness, his wit, the way he listened to her stories with genuine interest. Those moments felt real, untainted by the shadows of her insecurities. Despite her fears, Margaret couldn't resist spending more time with him. They continued to meet for coffee, go on walks, and exchange texts late into the night. Each interaction chipped away at her doubts, though they never fully disappeared. One evening, as they strolled through a small art gallery downtown, Eric stopped in front of a painting of a vibrant sunset over a calm ocean. "It reminds me of you," he said quietly. Margaret blinked, startled. "Why on earth would it remind you of me?" "Because," he said, his gaze fixed on the painting. "It's beautiful, layered, and surprising. You don't expect all the colors to come together like that, but when they do, it just works." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to dismiss his words, brush them off with self-deprecating humor, but the sincerity in his voice stopped her. Later that night, as she lay in bed, his words played over and over in her mind. Was it possible that he truly saw her that way? Margaret couldn't deny the joy he brought into her life, but the fear of what others might think still loomed large. She imagined the judgmental whispers, the raised eyebrows, the assumptions people would make about her and Eric. And yet, deep down, she also felt a burgeoning defiance. Why should she care? She had spent so much of her life conforming to expectations, doing what was proper, what was expected. Couldn't she, for once, follow her heart? The question lingered as she drifted to sleep, her dreams filled with images of Eric's smile, the warmth of his presence, and the vivid colors of a sunset painting that now felt like a mirror of her emotions. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that it was time to take a step forward, no matter how tentative. Their time together had started to feel like the most honest and fulfilling part of her life, yet there was an invisible line she hesitated to cross. One Friday evening, she found herself in her kitchen, absent-mindedly slicing vegetables for a dinner she wasn't hungry for. Her thoughts circled back to Eric. She'd always been content to let their friendship unfold naturally, but now, her feelings demanded acknowledgement, at least to herself. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Eric. "Eric, hope your day went well. Thought of you when I saw this." Attached was a photo of an old bookshop, its shelves overflowing with well-worn treasures. She smiled, remembering their shared love for stories and the hours they'd spent discussing books. "Margaret, it's lovely. I'd love to visit it someday." The words were sent before she could overthink them. Her heart raced. Why did such small exchanges feel monumental? After a few moments of pacing the kitchen, an idea struck her. She turned off the stove, set the knife aside, and picked up her phone again. "Margaret, do you have plans tomorrow evening? I was thinking of making dinner, and it'd be nice to have company." She hit send and immediately questioned herself. Was this too forward? Too presumptuous? Her hands felt clammy as she clutched the phone, waiting for his response. The reply came quickly. "Eric, I'd love that. What time should I come over?" She exhaled, her nerves tangled with a flicker of excitement. The next day, Margaret poured herself into preparations. She cleaned every corner of her modest home, fretting over details she hadn't cared about in years. What if he noticed the outdated curtains, or the faint crack in the wall near the bookshelf? Her heart raced as the evening approached. She set the table with her best dishes, lit a few candles, and played soft music in the background. The house felt warmer, more alive, as though it mirrored the emotions she tried so hard to contain. When the doorbell rang, she paused, smoothing her dress and taking a deep breath. She opened the door to find Eric standing there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "Hi," he said, his boyish grin making her stomach flip. "These made me think of you." Margaret smiled, her nerves melting into a quiet sense of gratitude. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. As he entered, she realized that this wasn't just a dinner, it was a declaration. A small, vulnerable step towards something that both terrified and thrilled her. The warmth of the evening wrapped itself around them as Eric and Margaret settled into the dining room. The clink of silverware, the soft murmur of conversation, and the gentle hum of music in the background created a perfect intimacy. She felt, for the first time in a long while, the weight of time, both its passage and its possibility, pressing in the best of ways. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily, as it always did with him. They talked about books, films, and childhood memories, finding common ground in the most unexpected places. But tonight, there was a subtle shift. The silence between their words felt different, laden with an unspoken understanding. She was no longer just hosting a young friend. She was sharing her life with someone who had begun to see her, really see her, in a way no one had in years. Eric leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine. "I'm really glad you invited me over," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I don't know if I've ever had such a calm evening." "It's nice." Margaret smiled, her heart fluttering. She felt a surge of affection, real affection, that seemed to rise from a place she had long since buried. She nodded, her voice quiet. "I'm glad you came." The air between them thickened with something delicate and undeniable. Margaret couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered on her, not just in passing but with intent. The way his eyes softened when he spoke, as if he saw more than just the surface, more than the aging skin or the lines etched by time. She couldn't fathom how that could be possible. And yet she felt it. She felt seen. As they finished the meal, Eric helped clear the table. Margaret was standing by the sink when she felt his presence beside her. He reached for a dish, and in the close quarters of the small kitchen, their hands brushed. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth that sent an unexpected thrill through her. She quickly pulled her hand away, as though it were too much too soon. But Eric didn't pull back. Instead, he paused, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice low, "I've been wanting to tell you something." Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward him, a mix of curiosity and anticipation rising within her. "What is it?" He looked at her, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside ceased to exist. "I don't know how to explain it, but being with you, it feels like I've known you for so much longer than I have. Like I'm meant to be here in this moment with you." The words hit her like a wave. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to laugh or cry, overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions she hadn't dared to face until now. Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "Eric, you're younger than me." He smiled, his eyes twinkling. "I know. But age doesn't change how I feel, Margaret. Not at all." Her pulse raced. What was she supposed to say to that? Could she even put her thoughts into words? The fear of judgment, of misunderstanding, tried to rise in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Tonight, she realized, was not about reason. It was about connection. I'm not sure I know how to handle this," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived a quiet life for so long. I don't know how to do something like this." Eric stepped closer, gently placing his hand over hers. "Neither do I," he said. "But I want to try." The simplicity of the moment, the honesty in his words, was enough to still her heart. And in that stillness, she knew, this was no longer just a fleeting moment. This was something more, something real. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to let go, to stop questioning the feelings that had been slowly blooming between them. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew that, for tonight at least, it was enough just to feel the warmth of his presence beside her. The days that followed Eric's visit felt different. Margaret went through the motions of her routine. Work, errands, quiet evenings. But there was a hum beneath everything, a new awareness. She would catch herself smiling in the middle of the day, recalling his voice, the way he looked at her with that gentle but unshakable intensity. She couldn't stop thinking about him, and about the truth that was starting to settle in her heart. She had spent so many years trying to ignore the passage of time, focusing instead on the rhythm of the life she had built, a life that felt safe, comfortable, predictable. But now, in this unexpected chapter, everything felt uncertain, as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting, yet she didn't feel the panic she had once imagined in such a situation. Instead, there was a thrill, a quiet exhilaration. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair one afternoon, the light streaming through the window and casting soft shadows on the walls. The house was quiet, too quiet perhaps. It was during these moments of solitude that the doubts would creep in, as they always did. How could this work? What would people say? Could she really build something with someone so much younger, when the world would view it as a kind of misstep? A mistake? Her thoughts drifted back to her conversation with Eric. His words echoed in her mind. "Age doesn't change how I feel." She closed her eyes, savoring the simplicity of that statement. It was the absence of judgment, the acceptance, that had struck her the most. It was easy to fear the future, to let the weight of society's expectations trap her in a box she hadn't chosen. But as the days wore on, she began to realize something crucial. She wasn't just grappling with the fear of judgment from others. She was grappling with the fear of letting herself feel something so powerful and new. Love, she had always believed, was reserved for the young, the beautiful, the hopeful. But Eric had shown her that love wasn't about years or appearances. It was about connection, understanding, and vulnerability. It was about two people seeing one another clearly, without the lens of age or status clouding the view. Her reflection brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. She understood, then, that her age didn't diminish her capacity to love, nor did it make her less deserving of love in return. Life was long, and there was still so much left to discover. Perhaps it wasn't about trying to turn back the clock, but about embracing the time she had left without regret. And more than that, Margaret understood that her desires were valid. She wasn't selfish or foolish for wanting him. She was human. She was alive. She was capable of feeling deeply, no matter the years between them. She sat up straighter, the weight of her thoughts finally lifting. The future would unfold as it would, But for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt ready to face it. She wasn't afraid of her feelings anymore. She was no longer going to question them. Because in the end, love wasn't about age. It was about the courage to open your heart, even when the world might not understand. And Margaret was ready to embrace that courage, to step into the unknown with Eric by her side. The next time Margaret saw Eric, it felt different, deeper, more assured. There was a quiet certainty in the way they exchanged glances, as if their souls had already understood one another, long before they had the words. The intimacy between them had grown effortlessly, nurtured by time, trust, and shared moments. It wasn't just about love. It was about two people who had found something rare and beautiful in each other, despite the odds, despite what the world might think. They spent the evening in her home, talking, laughing, and simply being. Margaret realized, with a clarity she hadn't expected, that she had come to a place of peace. The weight of her initial fears had dissipated, replaced by something that felt like freedom. There was no longer any hesitation in her touch, no uncertainty in the way they looked at each other. They were together, in this moment, without apology or shame. As they sat side by side, their fingers brushing occasionally, Margaret found herself thinking about how different this was from the love she had known in the past. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was in the quiet moments, the shared cup of tea, the stolen glances, the simple acts of kindness that had grown between them. It was in the way Eric made her feel seen, heard, valued, not as an older woman, but as a woman worthy of love and desire just as she was. Her thoughts wandered to the lessons she had learned from this unexpected connection. She had spent so many years hiding from vulnerability, afraid that age would make her invisible, that time would render her irrelevant. But Eric had shown her otherwise. Love didn't have an expiration date, and neither did desire. They were living proof of that. In each other's eyes, they had found something that defied convention, a love that was as pure as it was timeless. Margaret knew that life wasn't always simple, that challenges would arise. They would face judgment, questions, and the complexities that came with their age difference. But as she looked at Eric, his eyes warm and open, she knew one thing for certain. Their love was real. And that was enough. She wasn't afraid anymore. Margaret had come to understand that love was not about how much time had passed or how much time was left. It was about taking risks, about choosing to live fully, without regret, without fear. It was about embracing all the possibilities the heart could hold, regardless of age. As they sat in the dimming light, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, Margaret realized that the story she had once thought was behind her, the story of love, of intimacy, of feeling alive, was just beginning. And no matter what came next, she would follow her heart, without hesitation, without fear. Because in the end, love, real love, transcends all boundaries. And it had found her, in the most unexpected of places, at the most unexpected of times. She smiled to herself, knowing that she had made the right choice, and that she was ready for whatever the future would bring, as long as it was with him.